Australia versus Canada, or Canada versus Australia, whichever. Two great countries that I have had the pleasure of living in. For those of you who don't know me, I was born and raised in Canada. I lived the first 25 years of my life in Canada. And needless to say, I know Canada very, very well. But I also had the pleasure of studying, albeit for a pretty brief period, in Australia. I went on exchange there and I had a great experience studying and living in Australia as well. I have many friends in Australia. I also have family in Australia, and I've gotten to know Australia pretty well over the last few years. So I want to make this video to discuss living in Australia versus living in Canada. Two great countries with its fair share of similarities, but there are some pretty stark differences between the two countries as well. So in this video, I'm going to discuss 7 things that I'm going to talk about when it comes to living in Canada versus Australia. 7 points that I think you're going to find very interesting. 7 points that encompass its similarities and its differences as well. So I'm going to jump into that right now. And the first point I want to bring up, the first thing that comes to mind, the first difference really between Canada and Australia is its people. Now, on the surface, I have to say that at first glance, Canadians and Australians might seem pretty similar. You know, they both speak English. They both primarily come from European backgrounds, but both countries have become very multi-ethnic and multicultural in recent decades. People from Canada and from Australia come from all different walks of life, and they are both very open-minded people, I have to say. But I think that's where the similarities end between Canadians and Australians. I've noticed that Australians do tend to be more outgoing than Canadians. They're a little bit less reserved, whereas Canadians, I have to say, are a little quieter than Australians. They're less outgoing, more reserved. When traveling internationally, I find that I could easily spot out an American or an Australian from the crowd. You know, I feel like Australians, like Americans, are pretty identifiable. Canadians, not so much. Canadians tend to be more reserved. They're not as loud and as boisterous. They tend to fly below the radar internationally whenever you're traveling, or even just on the international stage. Canadians don't like to rock the boat, so to speak, whereas Australians do tend to be a little bit more boisterous, a little bit more noticeable whenever you're traveling internationally. And I do think that that's the case. Even when I was living in Australia, I found Australians to be more outgoing and more sociable and more personable when compared to Canadians. The second major difference between Australia and Canada is their respective climates. Let me start off with Canada. I've spoken about Canada in the past. I've kind of dished on Canada's weather and explained why living in Canada sucks, and in large part that is due to its weather. You can check out the video that I made on that, located right here. But yeah, Canada does have some pretty horrendous weather, whereas Australia tends to have more pleasant and comfortable weather. Canada, for example, has mainly a temperate climate in the southern half of the country and a full-on Arctic frozen tundra climate in the northern half of the country. Canada sees some really long, harsh, and snowy winters. Winter in Canada lasts really, really, really long. I'm talking about 6 months or more. And it also sees a relatively cool and short summer. In general, Canada is a colder country. It is a cold country. Cold weather lasts for the majority of the year, and the same cannot be said about Australia. Australia, as you may know, is a very warm, even hot and tropical country where most people enjoy nice weather. Obviously, this depends on the region, but in general, Australia has a hot, arid, tropical, or even Mediterranean climate. So most of the country sees pretty warm weather throughout the year. You know, the winters there are pretty mild. You know, they're cool, but they're not cold. You might see cooler days, but you won't see freezing temperatures. So winters in Australia tend to be relatively short and they're pretty mild. They're not really cold. On the other hand, summers are very long and they're very hot, and you get a lot of sunshine in the summer. So Australia's weather and climate is very different when compared to that of Canada's. In general, I have to say that Australia's climate is much more pleasant, but I guess that depends on what you prefer. All right, and the third point I want to bring up is their respective geographies. Both countries are massive. Canada being the second largest country in the world by land area, and Australia being the 6th largest. They're both huge, they're both massive. Canada being a little bit bigger than the United States and Australia being a little bit smaller than the United States. Canada's geography is quite a bit different when compared to that of Australia's. I have to say that Australia's geography is actually pretty similar regardless of where you are. Most of the country is pretty flat. The interior of the country, known as the outback, doesn't really have any major mountain ranges. It's pretty flat and barren. There is a major mountain range on the east coast of Australia, but even that mountain range is just not that tall. The mountains there are not that big, and the entire country is surrounded by water. So regardless of which direction you walk in, you're eventually gonna hit some water. So I have to say Australia's geography is not that varied. It's not that diverse. You have desert in the middle of the country. You have, tropical coastlines, surrounding the country for the most part, but no major mountain ranges. Like I said, mountains on the east, but nothing huge, nothing major. And aside from Tasmania, no major big islands either. So a pretty interesting geography, but nothing too special to talk about. Australia does have things like beaches pretty much lining its entire coastline, and it does have the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Queensland. So it's an incredible aspect of Australia's geography, but I don't think Australia's geography is as varied as Canada's. Canada's geography is very diverse. You have an enormous mountain range in the western part of Canada. You got the Canadian Rocky Mountains, you got the Coastal Mountains, you got the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, and then those mountains in the west give way to the prairies, the Great Plains, as you go from west to east. And those flatlands, those prairie regions of Canada in central Canada give way to the forests and rivers and lakes of eastern Canada, particularly of Ontario and Quebec. You see a lot of forests, a lot of enormous lakes, rivers, your kind of quintessential Canadian wilderness. And then after that, as you move further east towards the Atlantic Ocean, you have a very maritime geography where you have a lot of coastline. Canada's geography is actually very varied. And of course, I'm not even talking about the northern half of the country, which is pretty much completely covered in ice and snow. So Canada's geography is very varied. It really depends on which region you live in. Whereas I feel like Australia, aside from seeing a few mountains in Eastern Australia, I don't think you're gonna see much of a difference in geography depending where you live. Okay, and the fourth thing I want to talk about are the cities in Australia and the cities in Canada. And I have to say that this is probably one area where both countries are pretty similar in. Both countries have their fair share of major cities. Canada has about 5, 6, or 7 cities that would be major metropolitan areas with a population of 1 million people or more. And same thing with Australia. Australia has a handful of major cities as well. And both major Canadian cities and major Australian cities are very multicultural, very international. Both countries are home to very global cities that have been hosts to major events and major conferences. I can think of, for example, the Olympics. The Olympics have been held twice in Australia, once in Sydney and once in Melbourne, whereas Canada has hosted the Olympics 3 times, once in Montreal, once in Calgary, and once in Vancouver. So both countries are very urban countries in that the majority of its people live in its major cities, in its big cities, and its cities tend to attract people from all walks of life, from all around the world. And so despite the differences that both countries may have, I think this is one area in which these countries are actually pretty similar. Big global cities in Australia would include Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and even Perth. Whereas in Canada, you can think of cities like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Calgary as being some pretty big global cities as well. In short, there's no shortage of cities to live in. You can find some great cities in both countries. All right, so I'm gonna get into the 5th thing I wanna talk about. But before I do so, I wanna let you guys know that whether you've seen my content before, or if this is the first time viewing one of my videos, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you can be notified every single time I come out with other great and similar content. And if you're liking this video, go ahead and smash that like button. YouTube really likes it when people like my videos. So go ahead and smash the like button. I would really appreciate it. And by the way, I'm also on Instagram, so feel free to follow me there as well. Okay, so the 5th thing I want to talk about are its sports. And I have to say that Canada and Australia do differ in the types of sports that their respective peoples tend to play and follow. In Canada, as you might have guessed, hockey is by far and wide its most popular sport. It's the sport that I think most people tend to follow and watch and even play. And hockey really does dominate the Canadian landscape. But Canadians do like other sports as well. Canadians also play sports like soccer and follow sports like baseball and basketball and football. Canada actually has its own Canadian Football League that is pretty popular in certain parts of Canada. In addition to that, Canadians also tend to play sports like tennis and during the winter do a lot of skiing. So those are some of the popular sports in Canada. I should also mention curling. I don't think curling is that popular amongst most Canadians. It is a sport that, like hockey, has a pretty strong connection to Canada and with Canadians, even though it's not played by the majority of its people. In Australia, on the other hand, popular sports, I think the most popular one would be AFL, Australian Rules Football, which is a sport that is called football, but it's nothing like the Canadian and American versions of football or the British version of football. Something I never really got acquainted with, but it's very popular in Australia. In addition to Australian rules football, cricket is also very popular in Australia, as well as rugby league and rugby union. And other outdoor sports like tennis and golf and even surfing are also very popular. So both countries tend to produce some pretty athletic people, and both countries really love their respective sports. But I think that the sports that both countries follow tend to be different from one another. Yes, there is some crossover. Both Australians and Canadians do play sports like basketball. Basketball, like soccer, has become a bit of a global sport. But with that being said, I think there are some pretty big differences in the sports that both Australians and Canadians follow. A couple more points I want to bring up, and the next point, the sixth point, is travel. And both countries tend to differ when it comes to how people travel domestically and internationally. I've noticed that Australians have a lot easier time traveling domestically. When I was living in Australia, I noticed that there were more discount carriers operating there. There were carriers like Jetstar and Tiger Air and Virgin Australia that offered pretty cheap flights throughout the country. So whenever I wanted to travel within Australia, it was actually pretty cheap to do so. Whereas in Canada, you have two major carriers that dominate the Canadian airline industry, and they both charge a pretty high price to travel within the country. So I feel traveling domestically is a lot harder in Canada than in Australia. But of course, Canadians do have the option of traveling by car, and I think that's actually pretty easily done so long as you're kind of staying within your region. So if you're traveling within Eastern Canada, you can easily travel by car. Same thing if you're traveling within Western Canada, you can again travel pretty easily by car. There's a major highway network linking major cities in their respective regions. I don't think that's necessarily the case in Australia. I think Australians still prefer to travel by air, and I'm not too certain if there's a major highway network linking the major cities of Australia. I think last I heard, Melbourne and Sydney had recently been linked by a major divided highway for the first time in ever. However, traveling internationally is probably easier done from Canada. I think this is primarily due to the fact that Canada borders the United States. So if you are living in Toronto or in Montreal and you want to travel to a city like New York or Boston or Philadelphia or even Washington, you could easily drive to those destinations. You can drive to pretty much any city in the United States. Same thing if you live in Vancouver. You could easily drive to cities like Seattle or Portland or even up and down the entire west coast of the United States. And obviously that can't really be done from Australia. Even when traveling by air, a 3-hour flight from Toronto or from Montreal gets you to Mexico or gets you to the Caribbean. Whereas in Australia, a 3-hour flight from Sydney will get you to New Zealand, but that's pretty much it. You can't really drive your way out of Australia. Australia is a continent. And aside from New Zealand, I think the next closest nation is Indonesia. And I think that's like a 6-hour flight to get there. So I feel like the international traveling options from Australia are a little bit more limited. You absolutely have to take a flight. And even then, I think your traveling options are a little bit more limited. Like I said, New Zealand is about a 3-hour flight from Sydney and even more from other cities. And Indonesia or other parts of Asia is about 6 hours away or more. So travel from Australia is a little bit more harder to do if you want to travel internationally. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about are its economies. And I have to say that both Canada and Australia have very strong and highly developed market economies. Canada has the 10th largest economy in the world, whereas Australia has the 14th. So both very highly developed economies, and many industries operate in both of those countries. Some of the top industries in Canada include financial services, mining, and manufacturing. And as you might expect, those same industries also dominate the Australian landscape as well. So while Canada and Australia might differ in terms of its people, its geography, its climate, and the sports that they follow, they're pretty similar economically. Both have very strong, highly developed market economies, and they're both in general doing pretty well on the world stage. What are your thoughts, everyone? Have you ever lived in Canada or Australia, or are you considering moving to one of those countries? What do you think of the points I brought up? What have your experiences been? Let me know in the comment section below. I would love to hear your thoughts. And like I said earlier, guys, whether you've seen my content before or if this is the first time viewing one of my videos, go ahead and subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you can be notified every single time I come out with other great and similar content. And if you like this video, go ahead and smash that like button. It really helps me understand what type of content I should keep putting out there. Oh, and by the way, feel free to follow me on Instagram. You can join me there as well. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you soon.